To this point in the video series, we have begun to look at the political and economic aspects of the New World Order. Next, we will look at the military aspects of it.
Now, the topic for this afternoon's debate is the Gulf War, with particular focus on what are the implications of the war and its outcome for the so-called New World Order, and what really happened and why. And we are, of course, very honored today to have two such distinguished debaters. We flipped a coin, and Dr. Chomsky will be going first. Dr. Noam Chomsky is Institute Professor of Linguistics and Philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he is known internationally for his pioneering contributions to linguistic theory. But Dr. Chomsky is also very widely known for his outspoken dissent from American policy in the Middle East, and he is the author of over a dozen works on international relations and politics, including Peace in the Middle East. W. Scott Thompson has been a member of both the Ford and Reagan administrations. He is adjunct professor of international politics at Georgetown University, and he is on the faculty of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He's also president of Strategic Research Associates, and he is the author of numerous books and articles on foreign policy. And now, without any further ado, let's begin the debate. And our first speaker is Dr. Chomsky.
Well, the New World Order is a large topic, and I'm not going to be able to say much about it. Let me begin with a few commonplace but important observations. First is that for the past 20 years or so, it's been quite obvious that the world is moving towards what's now conventionally called a tripolar economic system, three major economic powers. The United States still happens to be the largest economy, but it's facing serious social and economic problems. These became aggravated quite severely during the Reagan-Bush years. Meanwhile, German-led continental Europe and Japan and its environment are continuing their economic growth. The general facts about this should be pretty familiar, so I won't elaborate. The second point about the emerging New World Order is that of the three, the United States is the only significant military power, and likely to remain so. With the collapse of the system of Soviet tyranny, there is no longer any deterrent to the use of force by the United States, and that's surely an important fact about the New World Order. So what we have emerging is a world that's tripolar economically, with a huge but declining economic power that holds a virtual monopoly of force, with the system of deterrence having collapsed. Now, turning to the Gulf War, I think that helps understand the interplay of these factors and what they imply about the emerging world system. To begin with, let's begin with the first days of the Bush administration. Every president calls for a national security review by the CIA and the Pentagon. The Bush administration did too. We usually only learn about it 30, 40 years later. In this case, one section was leaked having to do with what are called third world threats. This, remember, is the early days of the administration when Saddam Hussein and George Bush were close friends. The section had to do with third world threats. And it says that when the United States confronts what it calls a much weaker enemy, it is necessary not merely to defeat it, but to defeat it decisively and rapidly. The reason is anything else would be too embarrassing and would undercut political support for the United States, which is recognized to be very thin. Now, several points. First, notice that there's nothing about diplomacy and other peaceful means, which is quite natural. The United States is militarily strong, but politically weak in the conventional formulation, accepted on all sides, that is pursuing goals in the third world which are quite unlikely to gain popular support and in fact are extremely unpopular. So it is therefore necessary to avoid diplomacy and negotiations, which are not a good idea in those circumstances, and to gain a quick and decisive victory before popular opposition has an opportunity to develop abroad or, for that matter, at home. A second point is that much weaker enemies, which are of course the only kind you want to fight, much weaker enemies have to be pulverized, not merely beaten, if the right lessons are to be learned. And the lessons are clear enough. They're directed to various audiences. For the third world, the lesson is don't raise your heads or you'll be smashed. Keep to your service function. Now, the United States will support the most murderous tyrant as long as he plays along. It will crush third world Democrats if they forget their service function. On this matter, we have a rich documentary record of declassified documents on the highest planning levels and a very rich historical record, and they're quite clear and consistent on this score. A second lesson has to be taught at home. Given the current circumstances, it's necessary to divert the attention of the public from severe and growing problems. The standard way to do this in the case of any state is to try to create an atmosphere of fear and periodic moments of jingoist hysteria. International terrorism was used for this purpose, the fraudulent drug war, General Noriega a year ago. But periodic episodes of this kind are necessary for the purpose, and quick, decisive victories in which you smash much weaker enemies are, in fact, a conventional way to achieve that end. There's also a lesson for the world at large. The lesson is that force is to be the decisive element in running the world, and that again is natural. That's our comparative advantage in world affairs. It's not in the popular appeal of the policies designed for the third world, quite the contrary. It is no longer in economic power, but in military power we absolutely dominate. Now, the events in the Gulf actually followed this script rather closely. Prior to summer, to say July 1990, Saddam Hussein was George Bush's amiable friend and favored trading partner. The Bush administration, the Bush-Reagan administrations had given enormous support to Saddam Hussein from the time, in fact, when Britain and the United States blocked Security Council resolutions opposing Iraq's invasion of Iran. Iraq had become the United States had become one of the leading trading partners of Iraq. Iraq had been first or second, depending on the year, in receiving credits from the United States for purchase of goods. When the House Foreign Affairs Committee tried to censure Saddam Hussein's atrocious human rights record, the Bush administration intervened to block it. Last February, when the Iraqi Democratic Opposition approached the White House with an appeal for parliamentary democracy in Iraq, they were rebuffed. You'll notice, incidentally, that the Iraqi Democratic Opposition did not appear publicly in the press coverage during the period of this crisis from August through February. That's a very courageous anti-Saddam Hussein opposition, of course, in exile, given the nature of that tyranny. which had regularly been rebuffed by the U.S. government, but supported by the U.S. peace movement. The reason it was excluded from the media is because of its positions, which in fact happened to be right within the range of those of the American and international peace movements, namely strong opposition to Saddam Hussein, strong opposition to the quick resort to violence. Since that is the position of the Iraqi democratic movement, they had to be barred from discussion, and yet if you want to read their programs, you have to turn to the European press. Well, that's prior to July. George Bush, of course, was quite aware that Saddam Hussein was a murderous gangster, but it was assumed that he was our gangster, and therefore he's okay. In July, Saddam Hussein began making intimidating moves against Kuwait. The State Department had a few things to say about that, namely they basically encouraged him. The State Department signaled pretty clearly to Iraq that it had no particular objection if Saddam Hussein rectified border disputes with Kuwait by force and intimidated his neighbors to increase the price of oil to maybe $25 a gallon. Well, Saddam Hussein apparently took that as a green light. Whatever was going on in his mind, I don't know. But in any event, he took all of Kuwait, an act of aggression, on August 2nd. And at that point, he changed from a murderous gangster, which was quite okay, to an independent nationalist, which is not okay at all. And policy changed. There were two responses to the aggression. One was the conventional response that the UN and the world community attempts in just about every case of aggression, that is condemnation, sanctions, and diplomacy. Now, usually that doesn't work because it's blocked by the great powers, the United States far in the lead, incidentally. But this time it was possible to pursue it because for once the United States happened to be opposed to an act of aggression. The sanctions had unusually good prospects for success, and there's no real reason to debate it because it's very likely that they had already succeeded. I'll come to that in a moment. The second response, which was quite different, was limited to the United States and Britain with some marginal and rather tepid support elsewhere, and that was to undercut diplomacy and to reduce the options to force. And that began very quickly. The Bush administration announced at once, unambiguously, that there will be no negotiations. By late August, the State Department had made it clear that it was important to block what they called the diplomatic track because that might defuse the crisis peacefully, and they didn't want that. And it was becoming a real problem by then because there were many possibilities on the table, including Iraqi offers, which the State Department Middle East experts called serious and negotiable. Now, there's no time to trace the record, so I'll just mention the last known pre-war example released by high U.S. officials on January 2nd called for total Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait in return for Security Council indication of some kind of commitment unspecified on two major issues that kept coming up, the issue of weapons of mass destruction in the region and the Israel-Palestine issue. The U.S. immediately rejected that. Again, State Department officials described it as a serious position that indicated intention to withdraw. The U.S. rejected it at once, stating there will be no negotiations. The U.S. opposition to this so-called linkage had nothing to do with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, as we know very well from the fact that the U.S. had also opposed diplomatic approaches to the same two issues prior to the invasion. Now, at that time, about 2/3 of the American population supported that settlement, even without knowing that the opportunity existed because it was kept very quiet. Most of the world supported it too, including, again, the Iraqi democratic opposition. But it was contrary to policy. Recall the security policy. There can be no diplomacy, and a much weaker enemy must be not just defeated, but massacred if the right lessons are to be taught. There were some official reasons given for this posture, but I won't insult your intelligence by running through them. Now, the reasons for all of this have been articulated pretty clearly, I think, mainly in the business press, the international business press. So, for example, in the Wall Street Journal, a Reagan insider, former Reagan Navy Secretary James Webb, had an interesting article in late January, January 31st, in which he described the Bush administration as one committed to brute force rather than other means, which, these are all quotes, which had relentlessly maneuvered the country into an unnecessary war. And it did it because they have a very serious domestic problems on their hands, and they have no idea what to do about them, except one, namely to exploit U.S. military power and turn the country into a country of Hessians, as he put it, that is, mercenaries, who will carry out a kind of a global enforcer role, expecting others to pay for it and prop up the economy. He happens to be opposed to that. Others who describe it in the international business press are in favor of it. So, for example, the British equivalent of the Wall Street Journal, the London Financial Times, says that the United States must become what they call a mercenary state, because somebody's got to keep order in the third world, and we're the ones who can do it. We no longer have the economic base, so others will have to pay us for it. In the Chicago Tribune, the main conservative business daily in the United States, their financial editor has been running a series of articles about this all through the period. He observes that the United States has lost its ability to compete successfully outside of what he calls the security market, that is, means of violence. And he says we should exploit this ability. We should turn the United States, again, he says, into a Hessian state, mercenary state, and ensure that others pay. We should pound on plenty of tables in Japan and Germany to ensure that they buy our goods and buy treasury securities and keep the economy going. Meanwhile, there should be a flow of profits. The huge profits from Gulf oil production should continue to flow to our economy and to our British lieutenant, also severely troubled. As he puts it, we should run a protection racket. What this is Chicago, remember, so people understand this. We should run a kind of an international protection racket. Other countries should buy protection from us. He offers the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation as a model. Banks sort of buy in, and if they get in trouble, the government comes across. But the real model that he has in mind, as the wording indicates, is the mafia. If a storekeeper in Chicago doesn't think somebody's threatening him, you buy protection from the mafia, they break his knees, and of course if you don't pay up, they break your knees, or worse too. But that's what we should be. We should be the international mafia, and he says that's the only way in which we can keep our control of the world economic system. There's much more to say about this. I see my time's running out. But let me simply indicate that these are some of the contours of the New World Order that we see rather clearly when the veils of rhetoric are lifted and we look accurately at what is happening. It's not a very pretty picture. It's not inevitable. It's also not unlikely unless significant counterforces arise among the American population. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Chomsky. And now, Dr. Thompson.
It's always nice to come after somebody who says such acceptable and everyday things as Professor Chomsky. I want to take a different attitude, different approach to the New World Order and to the war, but I want to start by describing a couple of anecdotes that will give you where I'm coming from, give you a sense of where I'm coming from, in what in fact I believe our comparative advantage is in the third world, which I have spent my adult life studying in the field in Africa and Asia. Starting with the issue of human rights, for example, last summer I had the privilege of being in Moscow with colleague Dick Shifter, the Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights Affairs, and we were calling on the Soviet Foreign Minister, Mr. Shevardnadze, the then Foreign Minister, who described in great detail his absolute exasperation. He would pull his hair like this and say how Dick Shifter would come at him and they would negotiate until 5 in the morning over one case and then another case on human rights. And then as soon as they'd finish the second case and it'd be 2 in the morning and they thought they had the issue settled so they could go to the UN and be friendly, Shifter would say, no, 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 there's 2 more we have to do, or no goodwill. And they'd go till 5 o'clock in the morning, and after 6 months, 9 months of this, according to the Soviet foreign minister, he went to Gorbachev and he said, you know, maybe it'd be just easier to give in and have human rights for everybody in the Soviet Union. And then we don't have Shifter kind of bugging us all night long. I'm proud of that. Last year I was in the Philippines doing research, and I was standing on top of a tall building, and a coup d'etat was in the works. It was succeeding. There was absolutely zero doubt in my mind that some young Turk majors and captains and colonels were going to take power, and that the same helicopters of the United States Air Force, which had got Ferdinand Marcos out of the Philippines 4 years earlier, were going to have to come and rescue Corazon Cojuangco Aquino from Malacañang Palace while the colonels instituted their new government. There was, in my mind, as a professional student of that situation, there was no doubt that that was what was going to happen within minutes. At that moment, there was a swoop from the north, which is where the 13th U.S. Air Force has its seat, at Clark Air Force Base, about 100 miles north of Manila, and 4 Phantom jets swept down over Manila for about 45 seconds, and that was the end of the coup. They bombed nothing, they touched nothing, they went back to Clark Air Force Base, the coup collapsed. I'm proud of that, too. I can also say, I could give you lots more examples. The role of President Reagan's speech before the British Parliament, which lit democratic fires all over the Third World, as well as in the Soviet Union, on June the 1st, 1982, when I was in the Reagan administration, and which many of us fought hard to have made. I think that's our comparative advantage in the Third World. It isn't that we do everything right, but once in a while we do get something right. And the war that we just finished is one that we did get right. Now, I will tell you that I will agree that we got a few things wrong. I was just reading on the plane this morning that detail what I had suspected had happened in Monday last week when the Iraqi troops were desperately trying to escape northward out of Kuwait. They had already said they were going to leave, and our spokespeople were saying, of course, the usual sort of thing, well, we're not sure they're going to leave, and all of this was, of course, a setup so that we could pummel and pound them, blow them to smithereens on the road outside of Kuwait, and further decimate the Iraqi army. Clearly, that is what happened in that particular case. All I'm admitting here, conceding, suggesting, is that we did what armies generally do in warfare, and that is, when things are just about over, you want to make your enemy, whom you tried to kill, be as dead as possible. That's pretty standard military stuff. The only difference here is that there's a new thing called public diplomacy, and you're supposed to be honest in public, and we weren't about that one. So let's concede that one. I think the rest is pretty much, you know, you're getting what you read, what they said it was, what you paid for, and everything else. The fact that 22 countries were prepared to join in some significant numbers, is no small deal. You all know the story, I assume, about what a nice guy this fellow is, Saddam Hussein. In 1987, when his army was about to lose against Iran, and he asked what he could do to his cabinet, and this is a true story, and one member of the cabinet suggested that he simply step aside for a few days to meet the Iran requirement that he resign before there be negotiations. And then he said, you know, and then we could have the benefit of Saddam Hussein's wisdom back in power as soon as the negotiations begin. That particular minister's wife was a mistress of Saddam Hussein, and when her husband did not obviously come home that night, asked to have him back, and for once he kept his word. Saddam Hussein sent the body back in 13 parts, as it happens. We were dealing with a monster. Somebody had to do it. And this wasn't just a marginal thing on the part of the French or the Egyptians or a lot of other forces that were there with us. It was important. It was not as such a place where we were fighting for democracy. I wish we were. I wish there were a well-ordered democracy in Kuwait and in Saudi Arabia. Although in the case of Kuwait, we had one of the nicest of all Arab regimes going, at least one of the most open that there has been. The fact that Kuwait is already declaring that it is going to move back towards and further from its earlier position a democratic system of some sort is indicative of who's putting on the pressure. After all, they have about $100 billion of funds in equities in markets that we ultimately control, and I'm sure they are aware that our leverage over their affairs is not inconsiderable if we wanted to use it. So those are the kinds of issues, indications of the way things are going, of where we've put our money. If it feels good to you that we won this war, it's because it should feel good, because we put a lot into it, and there were very important issues. We stopped a monster who was going to get control of all the major oil fields of the Middle East for all intents and purposes, and occupy the high ground of the Middle East, and be in a position to dominate, to have a unit veto on aspects of the world economy if he pulled it all off. It was not inconceivable. So the question really was, were we going to have this war now, or were we going to have it later? Given that we had it today, the interesting issue would be, how did we pull it off so successfully, given that we don't usually do these things so successfully? Professor Chomsky and I were together in opposing the Vietnam War. I think that, unfortunately, one of the problems is, as A.J.P. Taylor said of one European power, they learn from their mistakes how to make new ones. A lot of old warriors on the anti-Vietnam front assumed this was going to be another Vietnam. Well, it wasn't. The issues were clear, and they remain clear. There are a lot of questions that do remain as a result of the war. How divided are the Arabs going to remain? The United Nations Security Council has never had such an upsurge in influence and real power. Let's not confuse it with the reality that the United States lent it for a time. Nonetheless, real power of a sort as it has seldom had. It is not clear how long we're going to have the kind of backing from the Soviet Union for this kind of ventures in the future, given the direction of events in the Soviet Union. It is not clear how willing the government in Washington is going to be to put pressure on Israel to continue to behave the way we wish it to take part in a settlement, in direct negotiations, or in an international conference, or something in between, more likely, which can settle at least some of the issues that are there outstanding between Israel and the other Arabs. It may well be that ultimately the most important issue that comes out of this war in the Persian Gulf is an Arab-Israeli settlement. I think it's premature to argue it either way. The fact is that the war has unsettled everything. Everything is off its foundation, and it remains to be seen what diplomacy can do now to put it back together in some important way. The fact is that, and then one other question, did the punishment fit the crime? Yes, we went in because of an invasion of a friendly country. There have been other invasions of friendly countries that we did not go in for. Yes, there was oil there. Yes, it was because there was a combination of principles and economic issues at stake that make me satisfied with the punishment that was attached to the crime. I wish we could have gone in to every place that somebody has done something bad. I suspect Professor Chomsky and I would also agree on that it would be a even more unpleasant America to him, and certainly a less pleasant America to me, if we did in fact go into all the places where other powers had misbehaved, as had Saddam Hussein in Kuwait. Well, let's talk just a few more minutes about the New World Order that we hear so much about. Basically, we started hearing a lot about the New World Order prior to this war, prior even to the invasion on August the 2nd last year. In fact, it's something that goes back quite a while. You could argue, in fact, that there's no real discontinuity between what the United States has been doing since the time that it set out to build the United Nations and all the other organizations of the post-war era that have been the bedrock of international relations since then. But in fact, the New World Order has taken a change. Two things, obviously, the war in the Persian Gulf puts everything in motion in that part of the world. The other thing, obviously, that has changed that affects both that as well as everything else is the imminent breakup of the Soviet Union. I do note, however, as a Russian diplomat who's a student of mine and co-author with me of a book says, if in fact the Soviet Union completely breaks up and all the constituent republics go off to the side, the RSFSR, the Russian Republic, will still be the largest country on earth, and will still be the third most populous country on earth, and will still be the most nuclear powerful country on earth. None of that will have changed. So deterrence hasn't collapsed. It's just the will to play a role in this interregnum has collapsed, and the United States does have rather a free hand, which it obviously must use. Somebody's got to do something to maintain some minimal amount of order. What happened with the collapse of the Cold War was that countries like Iraq felt that they were free then to invade other countries because there wasn't any longer a Cold War to double-check them. In other words, in the past, if Saddam Hussein had contemplated such, he would have presumed that his ally, which was not the United States, it was the Soviet Union, got all of his arms from the Soviet Union, except a few exocets from France, got all of his arms from the Soviet Union, and if he then invaded a country, the Soviet enemy, which is to say us, would go after him. That's common historic deterrence, diplomacy, international relations. It's the way it works. That all collapsed when communism, that great system that we hear so much about in academia but nowhere else anymore, was when that collapsed in the Soviet Union for all intents and purposes. Okay, so that is why that worked that way. What do we see in the New World Order? I see the following, I would suggest the following propositions very, very briefly. One, we need to encourage regionalism with security apparati in the regions of the world doing their thing to maintain order. Secondly, and obviously, we need a larger Japanese involvement, not just out of love of Japanese, but partly out of love of yen. They're already doing that, playing a much larger role in AID affairs in for example, South Asia. Thirdly, I think we need to help in a variety of ways to minimize the destabilizing effects of the breakup of the Soviet Empire as their boundaries shift. Fourth, we need to maintain a moving coalition of states. There will be a few bedrock states like England, but other states in different parts of the world for working with us as 22 did in the Persian Gulf, as is necessary, because if we don't do it, at least for the time being, and that means the next 10 years probably, no one else is going to do it. And we would have tiers of allies, a first tier, a second tier, a third tier, and states would be, obviously would be doing this because of their interest, because of their alliance with us in, depending on the ideas that were at issue in the issues that were being fought. Fifth and finally, and most importantly, keep working on the central principal issues that, at least as I see the world, and in my travel in 60, 70 countries in the third world and around, is always the important issue for how people look at the United States most of the time, and that is keep pushing democracy. That's the big thing. It's what we started with. It's what made us relevant in the 19th century, what made us relevant in the 20th century. We had a new resurgence of it after President Reagan's speech in June of 1982. A lot of countries will tell you that they owe their democracy right now to the good influences of the United States in the 1980s under the Reagan administration. Doesn't matter, under the United States, let's just call it that. Not make it partisan. Let's obviously restore our economic health at home so we can afford to do the kinds of things that help all that. I think obviously in the Middle East, there's a lot of money that's going to be needed for the reconstruction of the area. There are a lot of problems in the rest of the world which need help, and unfortunately, the country that goes around acting like the number one in the world, which we do because we have to, and I guess because we like it, is also going to have to pay a disproportionate share of the bills. So those of you who are students, well, all of you, we've got our work cut out ahead of us, and it's going to be a busy generation ahead. Thank you very much.
The last few minutes of this video, I will cover the review of what we've seen so far. The New World Order exists. We've seen politicians and academic scholars admit it and talk about it. We know it's becoming more complex, and it's also more powerful. It's supported by a gigantic international financial and banking system. Academic leaders debate it and also support it. The media also has a role. By the way, media means everything, all the different channels of media, which is TV, radio, DVDs, CDs, and the internet. Increasingly, media is the internet itself. Journalism has a profit accountability. All the mainstream media organizations are basically corporations. They're held accountable to the stockholders of those corporations with a profit motive. If a story is not profitable, the number of viewers decreases. That's tracked very closely. There are methods of doing that through marketing, tracking how many viewers are watching. And if it goes down enough, then those media journalism corporations begin to lose sponsors, or their sponsors begin to ask for discounts on their sponsorship fees. So with that profit motive, if reports are not popular, then they either get very little coverage or not reported at all. In the case of the tremendous number and extent of atrocities committed by Saddam Hussein during the 1980s, for example, very little was said in media about it, even though it was very important, and at least hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died because of it. There was a little bit of coverage of the Iraq-Iran war in the 1980s. I remember that very clearly. But it was pretty shallow journalism. They really didn't go into the motives of these two countries, in Iran and Iraq. They didn't talk about Saddam Hussein in Iraq and what his motives may be and what he was doing. They certainly didn't talk about how the United States of America was supporting Saddam Hussein at the time. And this is played over and over and over again. We get the same basic, how can I put it, propaganda. It takes different forms, but in essence is the same. The big countries and their allies get to beat up on the little ones. And they can be very brutal if they threaten the New World Order. Since the 1960s, when I was born, there have been a bunch of wars by the United States of America and its allies. And during the 1980s, when the Cold War was still going between basically communism and capitalism, if you want to oversimplify it, there were over 60 significant wars in the world. Many of them were civil wars. The Soviet Union and its allies were promoting their ideologies of Marxism and so forth, and the United States of America was promoting, free trade and democracy and capitalism. They were competing. A lot of times, what happened is countries were fighting over these issues, and opposite sides were sponsoring the combatants in these countries. So there were a lot of wars going on at the time. Now, it's a very profitable thing, this idea of war. The military-industrial complex has to build a lot of weapons and equipment and provide a lot of supplies. That's very profitable for corporations. That provides jobs. That makes politicians look like they're taking care of their constituents. In this New World Order, we really don't know what the decisions are behind the scenes because most of the decisions are completely hidden from us in secret boardrooms and committee meetings and so forth. Now this professor, Dr. Thompson, who is the second debater, he belongs to the Council on Foreign Relations and has affiliations with the members of the Trilateral Commission. They have a goal of a single worldwide government. This isn't just a conspiracy theory. This is true. The New World Order is a single world order. Now, when you understand New World Order, it's a world order. That means worldwide. That in itself implies that they want to move it toward a single worldwide government. Now, the problem with that, and I'll get into that in more detail in another video in the future in this video series, is that direct representation government is under attack by a worldwide government. It's already under attack because of the New World Order. It's a government system that bypasses national governments. National governments are accountable to the voters. And these characters that are roaming around the world from place to place making decisions that are run through corporations basically are bypassing the voters. Corporations, especially international corporations, are the vehicle by which these globalist leaders can make these kinds of decisions that are beyond the reach of national government. As it turns out, when the policies that these characters make are approved and they're implemented, a lot of times it's after the fact that they are brought to the national governments, particularly the legislatures, for approval. Congress of the United States of America is a legislature. Other countries have parliaments, and these are elected officials in these governing bodies, but they're so busy themselves that they can only scratch the surface of the information about what's being decided. So in summary, basically the New World Order is a global rulership and a system of order that is led by committees. So now I want to quickly talk about what's coming up later in this video series. We're going to talk about implementations of the New World Order. We're going to talk about the opponents of it, who are the rivals, and what are their motives against the New World Order. We'll also talk about the specific ways that this affects us on a daily basis. And also we're going to talk about how long this is going to last and some other issues. So stay tuned, and I hope you continue to enjoy this video series and find it very informative.